Forum. My name is Raymond Hain. I'm the director of the Forum, member of the philosophy department here. This afternoon's event is part of a special grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities that was given to the Humanities program and Providence College in order to reflect upon, possibly develop, a kind of PPE minor here at Providence College. There's a committee that's been formed this semester to think about that, and our guest today is a part of that project. To introduce our guest, in a second, let's welcome to the podium Jae-yoon Im. She is studying political science at Boston College and is teaching for us in the DWC program this semester, and will be teaching a colloquium on American thought in the spring, and was a student of Professor Munger's some years ago. So please join me in welcoming Jae-yoon Im.
Today I have the honor and pleasure of introducing Professor Michael Munger to the Humanities Forum. Dr. Munger is Professor of Political Science, Economics, and Public Policy at Duke University. I don't know if there are any freshmen in the audience, but I first met Professor Munger when I took his class during my first year of college at Duke. Back then, my friends and I had no idea that Professor Munger was a big deal, nor that he would become such a big deal. And I remember my now best friend asking him at the beginning of our seminar one day, "Do you tote your book around everywhere you go?" Professor Munger just grinned and replied, "Yes, I do." Despite our ignorance and impertinence, my closest friends and I ended up majoring in political science at Duke, which, as everyone will tell you, is the best, most collegiate political science department in the world. At Duke, Professor Munger is also director of the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics Certificate Program. His research focuses on markets, regulation, and government institutions. Professor Munger is the author of 10 books, including Political Economy and Analyzing Public Choices, Conflicts, and Practices. His most recent book is entitled Tomorrow 3.0, The Sharing Middleman Economy. Dr. Munger has also authored over 100 peer-reviewed articles, as well as 300 opinion articles in the popular press. In addition to being a prolific economist, researcher, and writer, Professor Munger is an inspiring teacher and colleague. In college, I distinctly remember my advisor telling me that the most perplexing thing about Professor Munger was that intellectually, he is a libertarian, but in his actions, he is a selfless colleague, as evidenced by his service and commitment to the Department of Political Science. Similarly, I have heard from his colleagues elsewhere that Professor Munger inspires their own teaching. When I was at the annual Philosophy, Politics, and Economics meeting in New Orleans last year, the discussant of my panel told me that Professor Munger has always been the gold standard for his own teaching, aiming to bring humor, clarity, and insight to our ordinary experiences. Please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Michael Munger as our speaker and guest for the evening.
Well, thanks for that. I should say she didn't mention the most embarrassing thing, which is that I ran for governor as a third-party candidate in 2008. And I found that when you run for political office as a third-party candidate, the only way to get applause is to lead them yourself, which explains my outburst. So that was why I tried to get y'all to applaud. It may be the last time. I have consulted in the founding of nearly 50 PPE programs in the United States. Philosophy, Politics, and Economics is one of the fastest growing programs, and I think that's a really interesting question to ask why. I also helped to co-edit the Oxford Anthology in PPE, which is essentially the first year curriculum of the PPE program at Duke. So it's a set of readings, and I'm going to talk about one of those readings today, because I was lucky enough to kind of rediscover a relatively unknown reading by John Locke. And in philosophy, you get more credit than you probably should for bringing forward a relatively unknown reading by John Locke. And it turns out to be a really interesting reading. And it is available in print in the anthology if you're interested, but you also probably can find it online. It's called Venditio. So the particular take that I'm going to use today is, you might summarize it, why economists should read theology. And in particular, why economists should read Aquinas. So let me say a little bit about PPE. First PPE program was founded at Oxford in the UK in the 1920s because they had a curriculum of classics or great books that, being British, they irreverently called greats. How are you doing in greats? Oh, not bad. Well, there was a problem, but a mismatch between the offerings of the faculty and the needs of students in the larger society. And in some ways, the PPE program was created there because they felt they were not creating students who were capable of running an empire. PPE was designed and has become more and more a kind of leadership degree. And the wrap on PPE students is that a PPE student can speak with great authority on absolutely any subject for 30 seconds. Now, that sounds like an insult, and in a way it is, but that's also in a way the goal of a liberal arts education. You have a context. You know something about the historical context and how these ideas fit together. Leaders don't always have time to think about things very deeply. And in particular, they may not have time to do what political scientists, economists, and philosophers do in the academy, which is to work really deeply on very specific questions. The stovepipes in academics are very frustrating. Now, I was fortunate to go to a liberal arts school, Davidson College in North Carolina, and they had a 2-year program called Humanities, where we started at the dawn of time and went to about World War I. And for 2 years, for 6 quarters, we looked at art, philosophy, music if we could, economics to the extent it existed, and problems of public policy from the Epic of Gilgamesh to World War I. Now, in a way I didn't learn very much, but I do remember that spring semester, my freshman year, there were 3 questions on the final. The first question was, describe the rise and fall of Greece and Rome. Now, could I do a good job answering that? No. Did I have some understanding of what had happened in the Mediterranean world for 600 years? Yes. Yes, I had tried to think about some very large questions. And so a person's mind, once stretched by a new idea, never shrinks back to its original shape. And so the argument that we have for the liberal arts generally and for PPE is that a university that's run by faculty for faculty, and I think too many universities in the US are like that. If it's run by faculty for faculty, it will tend to serve faculty's needs to the detriment of student needs. And we can balance that. Duke's a research university. I'm very proud to be there. I myself spend a lot of time on research. But PPE, the simple reason why I think PPE has survived at Oxford and why it's so important and why it's growing in the United States is that we as faculty should expect students to be better than we are. They should be broader. They should be capable of working on the large questions that we often say as scholars, nope, that's outside of the things that I work on. So often in economics, those of you may have seen this in economics class. If you're talking about an ethical problem, if you're worried about problems of morality and exchange, what's the economics answer? Oh, well, that's political science. We don't talk about that. PPE means you never get to say you don't know. You actually have to take on those questions. So I think there's 2 basic arguments for PPE. One is there's some research payoffs to taking advantage of the synergies in the study of unanswered questions. But the big benefit is to take on all the unquestioned answers that each of the disciplines have sort of walled off and fortified. So the Oxford program is, in American terms, a major. That means it's something that you specialize in. So I, in working with different programs, have tried to come up with a way of categorizing them. And programs can be integrated or not integrated. Integrated means that there are some courses that all the students in the program take together that seeks to combine the problems of philosophy, politics, and economics. If it's not integrated, that integration takes place, if at all, only in the minds of students. And the Oxford program, famously, is not integrated. So the students have to be able to solve these problems, but the faculty work off in their own areas. It could be, PPE could be a standalone major. It could be a major, but only a second major. It could be a minor, or it could be a certificate program. The distinction between these two is pretty arcane. But let me say something about being a standalone major. I worry that PPE or any program that's interdisciplinary like that, that is a standalone major, just means that people are going to be confused in 3 disciplines. That's not really good enough. What I would like is for someone to study deeply in one of the traditional departments and have a major in that program. And then you add something else. Interdisciplinarity means you've mastered something and you're using it to apply it to something else, not just to be confused in 3 disciplines. Now, there are plenty of people that take this approach. UNC Chapel Hill, our sister program, has just become a major. There are a number of very, very good programs, and as I said, Oxford is the best. A compromise might be to allow it to be a major, but only as a second major. Almost everyone at Duke has 2 majors. It's common many places to have double majors. So you can have it as a larger major, but then you also have to have something else. A minor or a certificate program, a minor usually is within a discipline. A certificate is an interdisciplinary program that only has 6 courses. So it's a smaller set of courses. And that's what the PPE program at Duke is. So Duke would fit into the integrated certificate program. So I think it's a partial palliative to the problems that are facing academic research and undergraduate education. Economics and political theory, their philosophical foundations in analytics, epistemology, ethics, and intellectual history have been subject to 2 conflicting trends. First, they've become stovepiped and specialized, and the second is the pedagogical requirements for creating an educated citizenry have actually gotten hard. So the universities have gotten worse at this at the same time we needed them to get better. Faculty have become more and more specialized. And you can see why you might want to do that. I would like to be one of the top 5 experts in the world in my subject. That's going to be easier if there's only 4 experts in the world. So if I can make sure that my area of study is so narrow, so arcane, I really am going to be the best. But it means that a lot of journals, a lot of journal publications, don't really talk to each other very much. And we need students that are better than we are. So I think Robert Frost's poem about the wall addresses this pretty well. Now, this poem is almost always misquoted. Now, I realize that y'all are liberal arts students and that you know the actual fact. He doesn't actually like walls. But the line from the poem that's usually cited is that good fences make good neighbors. Well, no, that's not what this poem means. So I think the fences between academic disciplines, though that they serve faculty, may not serve students very well. I let my neighbor know beyond the hill, and on a day we met to walk the line and set the wall between us once again. So it's a stone wall, and over the winter, some of the stones crack a little bit and they fall off, and there's places where the wall is not really strong. To each the boulders that have fallen, so we keep the wall between us as we go, to each the boulders that have fallen to each. Oh, just another kind of outdoor game, one on a side. It comes to little more. There, where it is, we do not need the wall. He is all pine and I am apple orchard. So we're different enough. We don't need a wall between us. My apple trees will never get across and eat the cones under his pines, I tell him. He only says, good fences make good neighbors. Before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offense. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down. So I think that's the reason to think about PPE, is the artificial walls that separate disciplines serve students ill. Now, that doesn't mean you can know everything or that you should study everything. We still need depth as well as breadth. But PPE, though that set of disciplines, is something that has stood the test of time for people who want leadership positions. So let me do an example. I'm going to talk about the problem of exchange and the problem of voluntarity. So, having criticized faculty for the specialization of their research, I'm going to talk about my research. Because, of course, my research is different. Usually, economists make the following argument. A voluntary exchange makes both parties better off. As a result, government policy should mostly be to reduce the transactions cost of voluntary exchange. Voluntary exchanges should not be regulated because, by definition, they make both parties better off. That seems to put a pretty big premium on what is voluntary. Are you here voluntarily? Some of you are here for extra credit, right? You're being paid. Are incentives coercive? Because you wouldn't do it otherwise. Let's suppose that it's true. I'm sure it's not. But let's suppose that it's true that some of you, without the extra credit, wouldn't be here. You're doing something against your will. Now, it wasn't that much against your will because a paltry amount of extra credit was enough to seduce you. But still, you're here against your will. Are incentives coercive? What's the difference between an incentive and coercion? Well, in Cicero, of Duty, talks about, and I'll mispronounce it, usually I don't worry about it, but here I would worry about it. So Quintus Scaevola, let's just say, we'll call him QS, the son of Publius, when asked to have the price of an estate he was buying named once for all, and the seller had complied with his request, said he thought it was worth more. So, I want to buy your house. That's a great house. Well, all right, I tell you what. It's 100,000 sesterces. Oh, that's not enough. That's not nearly enough. I'm going to pay you 200,000 sesterces. Now, would anyone actually do that? And that's the question that Cicero wants to raise. There is no one who would say that this was not the act of a good man. But men in general would not regard it as the act of a wise man, any more than if he had sold an estate for less than it would bring. This, then, is the mischievous doctrine regarding some men as good and others as wise. Can the good man be wise? Can the wise man be good? If these two things are really in conflict, I mean, suppose I say, I want to buy your estate. And you say, okay, yeah, I'll sell it for 100,000 sesterces. I'm thinking, man, that's way too little. But should I say something? Am I obliged to tell the other person, I'm sorry, that's not enough? Well, usually not in a commercial setting. But morally, maybe I do have some obligation. Are there circumstances where that exchange is not really voluntary because we're not both fully informed? Well, there's two concepts that I want to remind you of. The first is virtue. Virtue is a habit of right action cultivated as an intentional product of reason reflection in a social setting. Now, that's sort of an economist definition of virtue, I recognize. I'm getting it wrong for those of you that are Aquinas scholars, but that's an economistic paraphrase. Right action balances between vices, which are deficiencies or excesses of the particular virtue. So liberality is a virtue which lies between parsimony and prodigality. That is, I don't pinch pennies too much, but I don't waste money either. So liberality is something in between those. Character is the collection of traits that the person has cultivated, and my character is the combination of virtues and vices that I possess. Which brings us to this question: can the character of entrepreneurship be virtuous? Can the character of entrepreneurship be virtuous? Or am I just seeking profit? Profit, after all, to the economist is a good thing. Profit is a sign that I'm producing something, the costs of which are less than the value consumers place on it, because they'll pay more than it costs to make it. If they'll pay more than it costs to make it, that must be a good thing. Do I have to be motivated by something other than profit, though? Or does the pursuit of profit itself constitute a virtue under some circumstances? So the Mandeville story, Bernard Mandeville's story about private vices and public benefits, is people have motivations that are all over the map. And a lot of times they just act selfishly. But often the system has the feature that acting in my own self-interest redounds to the benefit of the public. And this is a lot of the story that Adam Smith has about the conflicts of self-interest. The baker who gets up at 4 o'clock in the morning, combines wheat flour, yeast, water, salt, and it's 5 o'clock in the morning now, and the oven is hot, and he's working the bread thinking, oh, man, I don't need this. That was a bread joke. Actually, he does need this every morning. And he delivers it to your home fresh and hot. What price does he charge? Does he charge a high price? No, his self-interest leads him to charge a low price, because otherwise he'll lose your business to someone else. So under some circumstances, at least, it does seem like a market economy can lead you in the direction of providing what consumers actually want. But there are other circumstances where that's not true. So are entrepreneurs vicious? That is, they act out of the vice of self-interest, but we allow the vice because of the good consequences? Or can you say that their acts are under some circumstances virtuous? And that's not usually a question that concerns economists. The question of virtue, the virtue of the motivations of entrepreneurs doesn't come up much. Many economists are consequentialists almost to the point of being utilitarian. So it surprises me that so few economists recognize the central place that Aquinas had in the development of the West. And again, some places I would talk quite a bit about this, but here I can say it only briefly. But let me say, at least give an example. This is question 77 from the Summa Theologica. And he's talking about sins committed in buying and selling. And talks about of cheating, which is committed in buying and selling. So we must consider those sins which relate to voluntary commutations. Well, can there be a sin if it's voluntary? It might be the act itself might be immoral. So maybe you think prostitution is wrong because the act itself is immoral. But suppose we think the act is moral, then can any voluntary exchange ever be a sin? We shall consider cheating, which is committed in buying and selling. We shall consider usury. In connection with the other voluntary commutations, no special kind of sin is to be found distinct from rapine and theft. Well, that's a pretty fundamental claim, because Aquinas comes to the conclusion that even though the pursuit of honest profit may not be a virtue, it is not a sin. That means that it's okay for Europe to develop a system in which merchants pursue profit. Because he would not have had to have reached that conclusion. Under the first head, 4 points of inquiry. Of unjust sales as regards the price, whether it's lawful to sell a thing for more than it is worth. Those of you in economics who have taken some economics, Jack, my man Jack, you're looking down. You're pretending to be busy. Can you sell something for more than it's worth? Is that possible? Preach. So if you can't sell something for more than it's worth, what the heck? We're talking about an empty box. Well, that's not the way most people think. And to be fair, Jack said technically, by which he meant in the Church of Economics. But in the actual world, where there's human beings, a lot of us think it's possible to sell something for more than it's worth. So of unjust sales on the part of the thing sold, whether the seller is bound to reveal a fault in the thing, whether it is lawful in trading to sell a thing at a higher price than was paid for it. Now, when I teach, I spend a week just on those 4 questions. But let me say just a couple things about that. Suppose I have a car, and I know for a fact it doesn't run very well, and I'm considering selling it to someone else. And they ask me, how does the car run? And I say, well, it's okay. It's a car. Am I obliged to tell them that I know there's actually problems with it? Most of us, I think, would say yes. What if I go to a garage sale and I'm an expert on art? And at the garage sale, I see this sort of crude drawing that I immediately recognize as one of Picasso's studies for a painting. And the seller says, well, that old thing, it's just some cartoon, I think, but the frame is probably worth $25, so I'll sell it to you for $25. I recognize that it's worth at least $1 million. Am I obliged to tell the seller? That's a different thing. The seller might very well be morally obliged to reveal flaws in the thing that he knows about. Is the buyer required? This is actually Cicero's question again. This is just like the estate. I think it's worth more than that. Am I obliged to tell? That seems like a harder question. The seller, after all, has the thing. The seller has the capacity to discover what its qualities are. Well, when we think about the ways that we could sell something for more than it's worth, fraud is clearly no good. If I misrepresent the nature of the thing, that's no good, because then we have different information. There's the Aristotelian problem of the inequality of the thing and the thing. That is, things have intrinsic worth, and their nature gives you something of their value. Charging more than that just because of the temporary exigencies of desperation in the market, that's no good. Accident could be we just have different, maybe I don't even know that it's a Picasso or a Van Gogh. It later turns out to be. And there could be monopoly power or some other advantage of restricted supply. So if I say it's gold, but it's iron pyrite, that's fraud. Asymmetric information we're probably worried about, but the seller should be able to discover what the thing is. Aquinas is worried about fault of the substance, that is not what it's claimed, or fault of the quantity, it's less or more. When I was weighing out the amount of wheat, I have my thumb on the scale. So it actually seems like 2 pounds more wheat than it actually is because I'm selling you a quantity of wheat that's less than I actually claimed. Suppose it's none of those things. Suppose I tell you that I reveal how much I paid. There's a famous story in an article in 1945 about a POW camp by R.A. Radford, an economist who was in a prison camp. And an economist in a prison camp, what would he do? Would he lament the human condition that we're in such a terrible place? No, he would go out and look at how people exchange stuff, because that's what economists do. So this notion that it's okay to charge whatever the market will bear under many circumstances is very important in the history of the West. Without it, the history of Europe would be completely different. So, tradesman is one whose business, this is from Aquinas, tradesman is one whose business consists in the exchange of things. According to Aristotle, exchange of things is twofold. One, natural, as it were, and necessary, whereby one commodity is exchanged for another. So those are the things the household does in order to acquire the things that it needs. That's fine. The other, so such like trading, properly speaking, doesn't belong to tradesmen, rather to housekeepers. So in other words, value in use is better than value in exchange. So if you're exchanging for the sake of money, that's not as morally laudable, but it's okay. It's okay. So I'm happy to share this. I wanted to document the discussion of the other kind of exchange. So an exchange that's not for things that you need but for money, or of any commodity for money, not on account of the necessities of life, but for profit, regards tradesmen. The former kind of exchange is commendable because it supplies a natural need, but the latter is justly deserving of blame because considered in itself, it satisfied the greed for gain, which knows no limit and tends to infinity. Hence, trading considered in itself is a debasement attaching thereto, insofar as by its very nature it does not imply a virtuous or necessary end. Nevertheless, gain, which is the end of trading, though not implying by its nature anything virtuous, does not in itself connote anything sinful or contrary to virtue. So there may be other problems, but it's okay. This is one of the most important passages in the history of the West, because it meant that tradesmen were not obliged, well, tradesmen were allowed, trade was allowed, trade and exchange are allowed, and in fact may be an important part of living our lives. So, let me give an example. And this, I had some of the readings that, well, I sent an article in which I described this, and I have to say that was written in 2007, and I've changed my mind about this. So I'm going to go through this very quickly. But I have changed my mind about the conclusion that I had in that paper. This happened a couple times this year, where on the Weather Channel you see pictures like this. But so right here is Raleigh, North Carolina, where I live and where Jack's from too. Way to go, Jack. And in 1996, when I saw this, Hurricane Fran was a Category 3 hurricane that was approaching Goldsboro, North Carolina. But then it swerved and went directly over Raleigh, North Carolina, which is where I live. 100-mile-an-hour winds, 6 or 8 inches of rain. And I had 35 trees. We had 35 trees in our yard. All of them were knocked down. There were trees down across all of the roads. There was no power for miles. So for 2 weeks, the whole area is completely devastated. You couldn't get around in cars because there's trees blocking the road. Now, when a hurricane comes up like that, it brings behind it a lot of tropical air. So for the next week, it was 96, 98 every day. And when there's no power, you start hearing noises coming from your freezer. First, because things are thawing, and then because things are alive in your freezer because they're rotting. So you really, really need ice. And 3 young men, or someone very much like them, who lived in Goldsboro, where a bunch of supplies had been prepositioned because of they thought the hurricane was going to go through Goldsboro. And I would claim that these young men, I've talked about this a number of places. I've tried to come up with a list of names for rednecks. If you have an extra one, I would like to know if there may be a Rhode Island or New England version that I don't know. This fellow is wearing a pillowcase with the arms cut out that says 100% inbred redneck. If you have a pillowcase with the arms cut out that says 100% inbred redneck, you may be a redneck. So these young men, or someone, like the middle fellows, the redneck gang sign, he looks like he's about to throw up. The point is, they had the technology and the tools that they needed to do something that seems like it's probably pretty good, and that is take ice to Raleigh. And in fact, if you were to imagine a omniscient, benevolent social planner that could whisper in the ears of these young men, she might have said, "Take ice to Raleigh," because they really need it. So what they did was they rented 2 refrigerator trucks and they bought a bunch of ice at $1.50 a bag, filled the trucks up, and drove to Raleigh. Did they do this because they had been washed in the milk of human kindness? No, nor anything else. There's no washing going on here, not for a long time. So the young men showed up in Raleigh, and this is the fashionable Five Points area. This is near NC State University. And they started to sell ice. They were not selling ice at $1.50 a bag. They were selling ice at $11 a bag. Enough people wanted to buy ice that a line formed. Enough people wanted to buy ice at $11 a bag that a line formed. Now, you may be able to guess what happened next. You've probably never been to a party like this, but sometimes it's just not a party until the police come. The police came. Now, why would the police show up? The reason is that North Carolina, like 34 other US states, has an anti-gouging law. All anti-gouging laws have 3 parts. The first is the trigger, the second is the domain, and the third is the limit. The trigger here is the declaration of the state of emergency by the governor or some executive official. The domain is basically stuff you need. So merchandise or services which are consumed or used as a direct result, or which are consumed or used to preserve, protect, stuff you need. If you need it, then it's in the domain. Does anybody see the limit? It's right here. So it can't be a price that is unreasonably excessive under the circumstances. It can be unreasonable. It can be excessive, but it can't be unreasonably excessive. The heck does that mean? Turns out it means 5%. Who knew? So the courts have interpreted that to mean 5%. Now, I do not mean in any way to denigrate Raleigh's finest, the police force, but they probably did not need a calculator when they showed up to say, hey, $11 is way more than 5%, more than $1.50. You people come with us. They arrested the young men, handcuffed them, took them to jail, impounded the trucks, took them to the police impound lot, turned them off, and all the ice melted. All right, so here's my question. When the police showed up and arrested the young men and impounded the trucks and took the ice, the people standing in line, what did they do? They clapped loudly. They clapped. They were happy. Now, why would that be? They had a moral sense that they were being taken advantage of. That was too high a price. That was wrong. And that's actually what anti-gouging laws say, is you can't charge a price that's too high. Now, when I wrote this article that I shared in 2007, I did something that in retrospect is actually pretty amazing. I can't believe I did it. So, because when you study economics, the first rule of consumer behavior is what? Consumers are rational. Now, economists generally think that consumers are rational unless they disagree with economists. Then they're clearly irrational. So these people here are just irrational. Obviously, the people, they're nuts. Those people are crazy. If they were as smart as I am, this all-knowing economist, well, none of that could ever happen. Well, economists usually talk about trade-offs and subjective preferences. There's 2 considerations here. One is the moral consideration that I think I'm being taken advantage of because of the desperation of my situation. The other is my desire for material gain from the exchange where I pay money and receive ice. But probably $11 is close to the limit of what people would have paid. The material benefit they expected to realize wasn't that great. Their moral outrage at being charged such a high price simply because of the desperation of their situation, they found very upsetting. Part of what changed my mind to make, so I happen to think it's a bad idea. I happen to think that price gouging laws are a bad idea. And the reason is that a price gouging law means that we're preventing people from bringing in the needed supplies, and it ensures that nobody gets any ice, which is probably a bad idea. If we allowed people to bring in ice and other supplies from outside, the price would pretty quickly fall, because price is really a signal that we need more of the stuff. But what I think is interesting is the sort of generic nature of this problem. So let me ask you this, because this seems kind of problematic to me. Consider two people. The first one is a person who's watching TV in Goldsboro, feels bad for Raleigh, and is watching TV and says, man, Raleigh was just devastated. That's terrible. I wonder what's on SportsCenter. And changes the channel, but honestly feels bad, sort of tears up for a second. That's person A. Person B says, let's buy a bunch of ice, put it in trucks, and take it to Raleigh and sell it for the maximum price we can get. Which person should be arrested? Really, B? Because B is making available to the people of Raleigh a choice they would not otherwise have had. The ice is not there. They're taking the ice there for this purpose. So Michael Sandel, Harvard philosopher, famously said, first objection to the claim that exchange is voluntary is an argument from coercion. It points to the injustice that can arise when people buy and sell things under conditions of severe inequality or dire economic necessity. According to this objection, market exchanges are not necessarily as voluntary as market enthusiasts. I hate being called an enthusiast. That can't be good. Market enthusiasts suggest a peasant may agree to sell his kidney or cornea in order to feed his starving family, but his agreement is not truly voluntary. He is coerced in effect by the necessities of his situation. That's just right. So economists tend to do this. They say, since exchanges are voluntary, we should promote exchange. Philosophers tend to say, if exchanges are voluntary. And there's a world of difference. So a lot of my work, and if you're interested in it, you can read the other stuff that I sent, was problematizing the idea of voluntary exchange. Usually economists think as voluntary as being the absence of human agency. If I hold a gun to your head, that's not voluntary. But if the asymmetry of our bargaining situation is so great, you're coerced by circumstance. If you're coerced by circumstance, it's also not voluntary. But let's take the next step. Let's look at Sandel's example. A peasant may agree to sell his kidney or cornea in order to feed his starving family, but this agreement is not truly voluntary. What's the public policy implication? He's right. I think that's right. And I'm so convinced that it's right, I have coined a new word. We take the Greek prefix EU, meaning well or truly, and voluntary, which comes from the Latin root voluntaris. So I've been told that I'm making monster words by taking this Greek prefix and a Latin root. But the word that I have suggested is voluntary exchange. Truly voluntary exchange means that you're not coerced by human agency, but you're also not coerced by circumstance. What's the public policy implication? This is not voluntary. Should I show up at the peasant's village and say, you should be grateful to me because I am the great white man. I am here to make sure that you are not able to sell your cornea. Thank me. The guy says, are you nuts? That means my family starves. You have taken from me the one thing that would allow me to prevent my family from starving. Now, do I want to do it? No. But you're marooning me in a situation which by premise was unacceptable. It's even worse. So what that means is that many things that seem like objections to markets are actually legitimate objections to the injustice of the pre-existing distribution of wealth and power, which for reasons historically of colonialism, racism, there's all sorts of reasons why the distribution of wealth and power is unjust. That doesn't mean that the market setting is one in which we should then, the solution is to say, okay, no markets. So a sweatshop in a third world country. And it's not child labor, it's not human trafficking, these are people who are working in a sweatshop. I go in and I announce, you're saved. I have arranged for all of you to be fired and this factory to be closed. Will they flood up to me in gratitude? No, all of them say, no, this was the best job that I could get. All the other alternatives for me are even worse. So unless you can do something to solve the underlying problem of the distribution of wealth and power, just shutting off people's access to markets makes them worse, not better. And if your concern is for them, rather than your sense of your own moral rectitude, you need to try to make sure you find some alternative that helps them. And I have made some Duke students pretty angry by asking them about this, because Duke students are very proud of Duke. They wear Duke on all visible and probably some not visible clothing. And we have, many of them would say, we should make sure and not buy clothing from sweatshops. We should buy clothing from other kinds of factories. Well, do you really mean that? Because what that means is you can feel good about your rich white self, because I'm only buying clothes that are produced by wealthy people. But the factory that used to produce these other clothes is now closed. It no longer exists. How does that benefit the people that you say that you cared about? So it's more complicated than I thought. It's actually true. Anti-gouging laws, I do understand the moral justification for. So, as I said, I shared an analysis of the Locke reading that's called Venditio. If some of you have read that, we can talk about that. I want to stop so that we have times for questions or comments, because I can easily talk all day. But let me remind you the reason why we went through this. I'm concerned that economists, to the extent that they ignore the not only nearly universal but valid moral intuitions that many of us have about the merits of exchange. Economists who live outside of that end up making policy prescriptions that are not very useful. But those people who focus only on the morality of the exchange don't recognize the importance of some access to market processes, as in the case of the sellers of ice, for people who are in a desperate situation. So the problem of voluntarity, the problem of whether something is truly voluntary, I think is something that's of academic interest. But enabling people to obtain the things that they want is pretty important. So let me say one last thing about the importance of price, because economists always harp on about why it is that the price mechanism is so important. If the price of something is really high, what does that tell you? It tells you a lot of people want it. It is a moral mistake for me to use something that someone else needs more than I do. Suppose that we are fleeing a hurricane that's approaching the coast. Everybody's trying to get 100 miles away from the coast. This actually happened during Hurricane Sandy. I was on NPR Planet Money, where people said, here's an economist who actually thinks price gouging is good. No, I don't think price gouging is good. I think that laws against price gouging are even worse. I heard this. At Duke University, there was a guy who was taking a knife and cutting people open. That was in the hospital. He's a surgeon. Does that mean I favor cutting people open with knives? Well, if they have appendicitis, yes. So suppose that we're in a situation of desperate shortage. We don't have enough gasoline, and we're all trying to get away from the coast. How could we signal to people, look, just take 2 gallons? Well, we could allow the price to rise to its natural level of $25 a gallon. That signals to me, just buy 2 gallons, drive another 50 miles inland. Leave something for the person behind you. But if we have a law that says you can't raise the price of gasoline above $4, which is what it was last week, I fill my tank. The first 5 people fill their tank, and there's nothing left for the people behind us. Now, the people behind us would like to be able to buy gas at $4 a gallon. What's the price? They show up the gas station has no gas. Infinity. The price has gone to infinity. They cannot obtain gas no matter how much they need it. So I'm a trained economist. $25 is less than infinity. I looked it up. So it is a benefit to me to have gas available at $25 a gallon. Now, you might say it would be better if they would give it away, because people need it. Well, they don't have enough. How are we going to allocate it? How can we get more people to bring it in? So that sort of difficult, problematizing what I see as both the certainty of both sides. Either markets are immoral and should be outlawed, or markets are always moral and should be encouraged, is the potential contribution of PPE, and that's why that I'm so excited about it. Thanks for listening, and I'm happy to take questions.
We have about 20 minutes for questions. If you would wait, please, and I'll bring you the microphone so that we can record your question, that would be perfect. And it's our custom to begin with a question from a student, if there is one.
Oh, there are students. The question is whether there's a question.
Couldn't the Duke students make the argument that, like, instead of shutting down the sweatshops, they instead would maybe want to just make sure, like, companies like Nike are paying their employees, like, fair wages? Like, yes, they're maximizing profits, but they don't need to be making the gross margin percentage that they are.
So let's suppose that the people in the sweatshop are being paid the equivalent of $2 a day. That's not very much. So Nike announces tomorrow, we're going to start paying $20 a day. What happens? A bunch of new workers would apply for jobs. They all have college degrees. That's the best job in the whole country. Within 2 weeks, those jobs are gentrified. All of the poor people that used to work there, they're gone. Because the people that'll work for $20 a day instead of $2, it's just gentrification. This happens all the time in cities. I don't see why people don't see it for jobs. If you say we're going to pay 10 times the normal wage, the applicants that you get are a much different kind of person. The only reason that these people are working for $2 an hour is that's the best that they can do. Their productivity is not very high. Some people get really mad at Walmart for this reason. Why does Walmart pay its employees so little? Well, you shouldn't be mad at Walmart. They're employing people. What you should be mad at is the other stores that don't hire those people away. The reason they don't hire them away is they're not economically productive enough to command a higher salary. So if you were to pay a higher salary, it's exactly like gentrification in cities. This has probably happened in a number of neighborhoods in Providence. So a bunch of my older son is 28, now has a job at Penn State, but he was a graduate student at NYU. The neighborhood that he lives in on the Lower East Side, when he first moved there was a little bit sketchy, and then a bunch of hipsters moved in. And they started having pumpkin lattes and avocado toast, and restaurants show up. And now all the poor people that used to live in that neighborhood, they can no longer afford to live in that neighborhood because rents went up. Wages are just like that. If you say we're going to have an artificial restriction on wages, then all the people whose productivity are below that are now unemployed. That's no different than closing it. So requiring that Nike pays a much higher salary is exactly the same. You're making yourself feel good and harming the people you say you care about. You must not really care about them, because all it's going to do is have a different quality of worker. Now, what you can do is have restrictions on human trafficking, have better safety, better health. So, but the problem is these are usually in countries that institutionally are just not capable of doing that. And it's hard for us to put pressure on them. But the wage solution is just not going to work, because you'll gentrify the jobs. You'll gentrify it right out of the poor people. The only people that will work there will be middle class. It's very tempting. I wish it were true.
You talked about question 77 with St. Thomas Aquinas, and you stated that a pursuit of honest profit is not a sin. This is because exchange is voluntary.
And I was paraphrasing.
Yes, but returning to that point, what would you think Aquinas's kind of outlook would be with your example with the ice in Raleigh? Because that still is gouging, and how would you define honest profit within that scenario?
Well, for Aquinas, clearly things have a natural price, and it would be immoral for me to charge more than that natural price. I don't know that he would say, as a matter of public policy, it should be illegal. Because if you recognize that a high price is a signal of scarcity, then other people look at that and they say, oh, we should take ice to Raleigh also. Why is it that there isn't a line of trucks bringing ice to Raleigh? And the answer is that the police laid siege to an American city. What is a siege? A siege is when a military unit surrounds a desperate city to prevent needed supplies from being brought in. Well, that's what we do after every hurricane. We put men with guns around the city to make sure that no one can bring supplies in, because they might sell them. After Hurricane Katrina, Duke students got 2 truckloads of supplies and tried to send it to New Orleans. They were stopped by the National Guard. Said, you might sell this. The anti-gouging law says you can't take this in. We're going to give it away. We can't be sure of that. You might sell it. So we lay siege to American cities. That would be an act of war if it were not the American National Guard doing it. So here's the problem. Suppose I say, it's really cold today. I'd really like to play basketball. After this talk, I'd really like to play basketball, but it's too cold. And you say, oh, I know what to do. We'll go outside, there's a nice basketball court, but there's some snow on it. And there's a thermometer. So you have some hot chocolate, and you put the hot chocolate on the bulb of the thermometer. And the temperature on the thermometer goes up to 80. And all right, good, now it's warm enough to play basketball. Well, you didn't change the temperature, all you did was change the signal. So if we regulate price, we don't affect the scarcity. The scarcity is the problem. There's not enough stuff. If we regulate the price, it's just like manipulating the temperature on the thermometer. We're not changing the actual temperature. What we need to do is solve the problem of scarcity. The only way to have low prices is to allow high prices. The only way to have low prices is to allow high prices. If we keep prices artificially low, there's no signal to anyone to bring stuff in. He's disrespecting you, man.
He takes precedence. Yes, I'm a little worried about the whole presupposition of the whole enterprise. It seems to be a course for imperial administrators. Doesn't that create a kind of disciplinary bias in the whole enterprise? And doesn't your solution, in fact, although you say all these inequalities ought to be changed, in fact freeze existing inequalities in place? Because there are problems with any attempt to change inequality. And there's no way that's try to remedy inequality which is perfect in every way. There's always going to be glitches one way or another. And at some point or other, we have to decide the game is worth the candle or the game is not worth the candle, and not do things to remedy inequality which make people worse off. And it's happened a lot that it has, but doesn't need to happen all the time. That's unclear.
Well, you asked 2 questions, and they're both good ones. It is true that this started with imperial administration, but it morphed into leadership, and I think we could do with leaders who have a liberal arts education rather than just experience, well, the experiences that some of our current leaders have. So to the extent that a broad liberal arts education should be a prerequisite for leadership positions, I would defend that proposition. You're right that allowing this, a lot of market people do exactly that. So a lot of pro-market people will say, whatever has come down to us from the past, that must be perfect. Well, it's not. If you look at the historical legacies of racism and colonialism, they're enormous. And the genocide of Native Americans, the distribution of power and wealth in the United States is not fair, and it's not historically, there's no moral justification for leaving it in place. My argument only was, let's focus on that as a thing rather than outlawing markets. Markets, given where we are, markets make things better, not worse. I have actually changed my mind about another thing, partly for the reasons that you bring up. I'm in favor of universal basic income. So some, at least, minimum guarantee for those who are least well off. I'm not as worried about inequality as I am about poverty. But I think there's a real problem with poverty that we have failed to address. So economists will object to minimum wage laws. Well, minimum wage laws have at their base a concern to make sure that people have enough money to live on. And they have some economic consequences that economists then focus on. But the economic consequences may not be as important as the benefit that you get from having a living wage. So I would like to separate those and say we need to recognize that markets actually can often be beneficial, but do something to reduce the degree of inequality that people suffer through no fault of their own.
So my question was actually very similar, but so basically on the lines of, so you talk a lot about how these injustices of wealth distribution and power and things like that are sort of the driving, shadowing problems that people look to markets as an issue. And so I guess you talk a lot about working within the system, making it better with what we have. And so you just addressed that you need to change these over-looming structures. So my question is, how do you, in a practical sense, it might not be easy to answer, how do you sort of combine the nexus of moral decency and empiricism and logic to sort of make a structural change? Or is it something that will just kind of happen with revolution time, something that almost can't be done with the tools we have, if that makes any sense?
Those were two really optimistic choices. It's also possible that it is not going to happen and that we have to do the best that we can. So I'm concerned we're actually moving in the wrong direction. So the United States is the only developed nation that has a private medical system and that ties it to your job. So I think if someone were to visit from Mars and they would say, okay, now explain this to me. Someone who has a really good job, they also have really good health care. But someone who's sick and loses their job, they don't have health care? I missed that part. Can you explain that? Well, it made sense at the time. So the other countries in the world all face, if I want to hire someone, I'm not paying the tax of also having to pay their health care. So I don't understand why businesses in the US are not campaigning for single-payer health care, or some system that's more like the German system. The national health system in England, government provision I'm less a believer in because I don't know that medicine should be run by the Department of Motor Vehicles. But in Germany, you have competitive private provision of healthcare. Doctors are private, but there's a national health system that you can opt out of, and you can also have private insurance. So I think universal basic income and single-payer healthcare would go a long way towards reducing the desperate state of those who are least well off. And people ask me, and this often happens, you're one of those libertarians. Can you point to a nation that you actually think embodies your principles? And then they sit back smugly, knowing that I can't possibly, because no nation does, except Sweden. Sweden is the libertarian utopia. Since 1990, Sweden has privatized its entire education system. It is 100% vouchers. Sweden has made it much easier to start a business. The one thing Sweden does have is a thoroughgoing welfare state. But the market system in Sweden is probably more capitalistic than that of the United States. We've had a lot of new regulations lately. So if you look at the freedom index, Sweden is a great place to be an entrepreneur. They encourage entrepreneurial thinking. So I actually think they're I am optimistic. I made fun of you for being optimistic. I'm actually optimistic because there are models of ways of having healthcare, of using market systems to produce a surplus that will allow us to improve the lives of those who are least well off. We should be able to have it both ways.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great talk. I've heard this thing about a guaranteed minimum income quite a bit. You hear it from all sorts of different people, from the right and the left, okay, probably for different reasons. One of the things that I hear, though, whenever you talk about welfare or even single payer or whatever, the German system is a good system for all I know, from what I know about it, and it would be fine with me. But you would have to do something the Germans haven't done, because we'll see how that whole works out, which is immigration. Once you start giving guaranteed income or guaranteed anything really, then you have to control your immigration in a particular way or you're going to go bankrupt.
Or you're going to see the rise of right-wing parties, which amounts to the same thing.
Oh, yeah, sure. And so since, you know, I don't think I've ever gone to a libertarian talk before. That's a Bildungsloch for me, but it's been filled now, so that's great.
Yeah, you can go on.
But we're going to stop right there. And because, but the immigration issue, sometimes I hear libertarians who have such a desire for the free flow of global capital, which I do not, they also have open borders.
You bet.
And it seems to me, you have open borders, you can kiss your guaranteed minimum income, which sounds like a good idea to me, by the way, goodbye. So how do those things, do they go together? Can they go together?
It would require a much tighter immigration policy, but a way to solve that would be guest worker visas. And so the only citizens would be qualified. But it's absolutely a big problem. And it's probably an insurmountable problem. If that were the main problem with implementing it, I would be happier. So if we were at the point where people said, you know, it's a good idea, but what are the implementation problems, I'd be a lot happier. It's just not going to happen. But actually, of course, immigration is always a problem if there's a welfare state. And Europe is finding that out, and I think many people in Europe have been surprised at the consequent rise of right-wing parties in a situation where they thought, you know, we're past that. So the foreigners have become this boogeyman because it threatens their welfare state. So there are people who were on the left have become virulently anti-immigrant. And I don't know the answer. It is a terrible problem.
Can I follow up? Why do you think
Oh, I think that there's no support for universal basic income just on the merits. I talk to a lot of people who say
what's the typical reason?
That it's too expensive and that it will create a generation of people who just don't work. And I think that's actually the best argument in favor of universal basic income. This is not going to surprise you. As a libertarian, I think the first thing that we should do is cut taxes. We should cut taxes on the Americans who have the highest tax rates. And who are those? The poor. The poor face a marginal tax rate of more than 100%. If I'm a woman living in Section 8 housing and I have 3 children and I have subsidized food, if I get a job that pays me $10,000 a year, I lose $12,000 in benefits. Social welfare people call this the benefits cliff. So I've written an article where I said that the state is a bad polygamist. As long as women are kept unemployed and unmarried, the state will support them. But if they make any effort to get a job, to do all the things we say people should do, they're cut off. So poor people are not lazy. Poor people are rational. If I get a minimum wage job and I find some way to get child care covered, I end up with a net loss in income. Stop doing that. Just give people the money. If you look at the amount of money we're spending on anti-poverty programs, it's pretty significant. If we actually give people the money, they would have, and it's not contingent on getting a job. If you get a job, you don't lose it. Well, what that would mean is that people might be able to arrange for childcare. They might be able to arrange for education. And actually, what I like about this is it smokes out the paternalism of many people on the left and the right. Because they say, oh, if you gave them the money, you know what they do. You know how they are. No, do tell. How are they? I actually think that there's many, many people who are responsible, would like to build a better life, but they have no way of doing it because they're trapped in the current contingent benefit system. If the benefits were not contingent, they could work their way out. We would lose some people who are now working at Circle K and living in their mom's basement and playing RuneScape all night. But they're not going anywhere anyway. So we're going to lose some people to the income effect. I'm worried about the price effect. The price effect says if I get a job, I lose all my benefits. So all the ambitious people end up working, selling drugs, or some not legal activity because poor entrepreneurs have no way of following the usual path. So my concern is let's free up a lot of the creative energy that's now trapped by the welfare system and the benefits cliff. So reduce the tax rates on the Americans who pay the highest tax rates, and that's the poor. Why are we taxing the poor?
Please join us at our reception just next door in the great room, and let's thank our speaker.
You guys were awesome.